like to look back at the year that's just gone and award prizes to those that have lived up to their expectations and brickbats to those who have not. And also, of course, look forward to the year to come to find new principles of hope and despair. Now, it seems to me that the left and the Labour movement in Britain has always been rather better at retrospect than prospect. We've largely advanced into the future, looking back over our shoulders at the wreckage of our dreams, a bit like Benjamin's Angel History, which, let us not forget, was inspired by Paul Klee's painting Angelus Novus. Now, I'm actually, in this PowerPoint, I actually had a slide of Paul Klee's painting. In a moment of distraction, I deleted it. So I'm going to describe it. I don't know if any of you have actually seen the painting. Some of you have, anyway. Well, it was painted in 1920 at a moment when the political future of Germany was poised between two rival utopias of modernity, communism and fascism. Klee was part of what has been called the lost Weimar regeneration. Young people who felt trapped between looking back to a pre-war world that had vanished forever in the horror of mechanized warfare and looking forward to a world where the application of science and technology promised emancipation from poverty and drudgery. It was also seen as prefiguring new forms of alienation and subservience. Klee had long been fascinated by the biblical figure of the angel of death, with its dual aspect as a harbinger of doom and an instrument of deliverance and hope. And in this painting, he depicts the angel as a very fragile figure, poised between two different kinds of flight. His gaze is drawn in fascination to something we're not shown in the painting, and also averted as if what is seen is too horrible to contemplate. The British left's attitude to modernity has been similarly ambivalent, if for more mundane reasons, because modernisation has so often undermined collective bargaining power of workforces, has brought de-skilling and redundancy, while for the working class as consumers, it has meant more or less magical liberation in terms of leisure and lifestyle from the petty constraints and dignities of wage labour. This ambivalence is part of a wider attitude to the present, past and future, an oscillation between what I'm going to call Proto Modernism. No, something should happen. Yeah, that. Which identifies modernity with progressive historical forces. It could be located in those forces in science, technology, the working class movement itself, planning, as in this image here. So proto-modernity there, and retro-modernity, which regards the condition of modernity not as something to be aimed at or achieved, but as something that has never quite happened, is possibly unachievable, probably undesirable, and in any case can only be grasped as a kind of retrofit. Now, the left has been has a well-honed pessimism of the intellect. We're used to be seen as the sort of party poopers amidst the spectacular successes of carnival capitalism, prophets and poets of doom. And then, of course, doom suddenly and unexpectedly arrived with the crash and the advent of austerity politics. The party, it seemed, was over. And yet no one really got the message. It might involve some rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic, but the band played on, albeit to a slightly different tune. The proverbial platitudes of common sense optimism, where there's life, there's hope, came to the rescue, as did the puritanical accompaniment to capitalism's pleasure principles. We all know there's no pain without gain. Well, I should say the wrong other way around, no gain without pain, whichever way. But there is another sense in which the party really is over. The crisis of social democratic parties across Europe stems from the fact that they've been unable to mount a coherent challenge to neoliberal policies, have failed to find a mode of address that connects with the concerns of the salariat and the precariat, and have instead presided over the dismantling and hollowing out of the institutions, agencies and narratives of collective aspiration, which hitherto enabled working class communities to sustain struggles of long duration and remain resilient in the face of setbacks and defeats. With Labour's long forward march seemingly permanently halted well this side of New Jerusalem, the sense of belonging to a community that survives their own death and whose continued existence guarantees some form of posthumous recognition or identity, some place in the collective remembrance of struggle has increasingly been lost. And it seems to me no amount of oral historicising and memoryscaping by the left heritage industry, however valuable as an antidote to the selective amnesia of mainstream popular culture, it can't create a living legacy of struggle once the material and cultural links between growing up, working and class have been broken, along with their intergenerational transmission. Now, if there's time, I'll come back to some of the implications of this for current forms of working class politics and community activism, but I suspect that Jeremy and Hiri will have rather more to say about that than I will. But I do want to consider for a moment the impact of that situation on the left intelligentsia, on the way we currently understand and practice our relations to class, culture and community. In the early 1990s, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the communist parties both east and west, Jean-Luc Nancy, a philosopher formed in the intellectual hothouse of Parisian post-structuralism, wrote a rather influential essay entitled The Inoperative Community. And this was the basis of a rather interesting exhibition, which I think is still going on. It's the Raven Row Gallery near Liverpool Street. It's a video-based exhibition, and if you have time, I really recommend you going to see it. Well, in this essay, in the early part of the essay, he wrote this: "The gravest and most painful testimony of the modern world, the one that possibly involves all other testimonies to which this epoch must answer, is the testimony of the dissolution, the dislocation, and the conflagration of community. Communism, as Sartre said, is the unsurpassable horizon of our time. If in fact it's no longer such a horizon, this is not because we have passed beyond any horizon. Rather, everything is inflected by resignation, as if the new unsurpassable horizon took form around the disappearance, the impossibility, or the condemnation of communism." Now, of course, Nancy is describing communism, or more precisely the French Communist Party, as a community of political activists, of working class militants, but also an intellectual community, a community of scholar activists. The memoirs of this generation, more especially of their children, bear eloquent testimony to just how much of a home from home these parties were for those who were formed within their orbit. It was the existential sense of belonging and the principle of collective hope afforded by membership of these parties, and also I think by mass social democratic parties as well, that enabled their members to turn a blind eye to the flagrant lack of internal democracy and the legitimation of policies and actions which ignored, traduced or simply suppressed popular democratic struggles. Now, Nancy draws a radical conclusion from the death of communism and the hope it represented in these terms: "Generations of citizens and militants, of workers and servants of the state, have imagined their death reabsorbed in a community yet to come. But now we have nothing more than the bitter consciousness of the increasing remoteness of such a community, be it the people, the nation, or the society of producers. The communion to come does not grow distant. It is not deferred. It was never to come. It would be incapable of coming about or forming a future. What forms a future, and consequently what truly comes about, is always and only our own singular death." Clay's Angel of Death here trumps Benjamin's Angel of History. Pessimism of the intellect overrides and destroys optimism of the will. Yet once these two halves of Gramsci's formula are split apart, we may find we have the worst of all possible worlds. On one side, an intellectual culture of endless solipsism, reflexivity and immanent critique, which puts in doubt its own heuristic procedures and knowledge claims and disconnects itself from anything outside itself. Whether it opts for a form of dialectical idealism or transcendental materialism, the culture remains imprisoned within its own academic devices, its specialised jargons and scholastic protocols. What underlies this culture is a profound pessimism of the will, the belief that now there are no teleologies, no laws of history or evolutionary logics to guarantee a progressive outcome, then there's nothing to be done except to observe struggles from the sidelines. And by a curious twist, this recognition of political impotence leads to a style of armchair, or rather desktop, theorising, which transforms itself into an optimism of the intellect. In other words, it reverses the Gramsci formula. A belief that by keeping the pure flame of critical theory alive in the academy, by separating an omniscient and totalizing analysis from the messy, compromising, contradictory particularisms of actual struggles, by doing that, a potential space is created which at some future point, when somehow or other the tide of history changes, this may serve as a map or guide to social transformation. Now, this pervasive theoreticism has in turn provoked a reaction in the growth of a culture of hyperactivism, which takes its lead from its own lived experience of struggle, its experiments in direct democracy, and its groundings in a moral economy of community and everyday cultures of mutual aid, what David Graeber rather mischievously called actually existing communism. Now, however necessary a corrective that is, this move to replace subtle dialectics with crude thoughts, I think, also has a price to it, because it can be that a premium is placed on kind of sloganized and reductive analyses and the ritual invocation of ideological catechisms. It's always capitalism or racism or patriarchy what done it. There's always a risk that the militant concentration of energies on a single issue or campaign results in tunnel vision. And what begins by trying to widen the range of political voices ends all on one note. As Kate Tempest memorably put it, if all you are is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In which you might add that even if you are hitting it on its head, the nail in question is often being banged into a rather large coffin marked Democracy, RIP. So I think the problem is that the cold and warm currents, what Ernst Bloch called the cold and warm currents of the left political culture, the cool objective analysis of structures and the passive passionate engagement in a struggle to transform them, they're no longer so dialectically linked as they are in Gramsci and Bloch. And in the vacuum this has created, we have seen the emergence of a new communitarianism on both the right and the left, and that's what I'm going to spend a few moments talking about, is this new kind of communitarianism. Communitarianism is a political discourse about social cohesion in which the loss or lack of community is a central reference point. Now, the Tories' communitarian term, which coalesced around the Good Society initiative, was part of a wider strategy to dismantle the welfare state and put in its place voluntary action supported by private philanthropy. It was also an attempt to strengthen the bonds of civil society, which were seen to be weakened by the new social and economic insecurities, and also to dissolve the residual forms of resistance provoked by them. The Good Society programme drew theoretically on the work of Amitai Etzioni in the United States. Now, Etzioni was concerned that social bonds under capitalism were simply impersonal relations between strangers regulated by state or market. He wanted to transform the social bond from a purely instrumental device into an expression of common values, a new kind of social contract which balanced civil rights and responsibilities. But of course he ignored the double-edged nature of the bond, which actually is implicit in the etymology of the word itself. The bond is a promissory note, which is a kind of performative statement of trust. My word is my bond. And it is also about social constraint. And under the sign of capitalist exchange, what connects people and frees them from their narcissism is also what imprisons them in relations of subordination within the sphere of exchange. And his notion of the bond actually ignores that kind of contradiction. The Good Society rhetoric borrowed the language of mutualism and moral economy in order to rationalise the marketisation of both and accomplish the withering away of the state. The so-called Red Tories tried to pass themselves off opportunistically as born-again guild socialists. But this was at best a devious manoeuvre. The first move was to split off the guild socialist sort of rather organic model of the body politic, split it off from the class solidarities in which for the guild socialists it was embedded, and then reinsert it in a model of community based on the principle of concordia discourse, order in variety, which goes way, way back. It was first enunciated by Alexander Pope in the 18th century. And this is in this poem, Windsor Forest. Not chaos like together, crushed and bruised, but as the world, harmoniously confused, where order in variety we see, and where though all things differ, all agree. And that kind of aesthetic model was then transferred into a principle of political governance. The political class provide the order, the overarching framework of representation, and the others, the other class, the other ethnicities, the culture, the variety. So that's the kind of formula of that notion of community. Now, left communitarianism has its roots, again, in a very homegrown English tradition of guild socialism, but also in council communism and anarcho-syndicalism, which emerged in opposition to European social democracy in the early 20th century. Common to both was the aim to develop the direct democracies and solidarities of the labourhood. I call them the labourhood. It's not just a workplace, it's the network of relationships that spin out from it. I call it the labourhood. To generalise those into a principle of civil self-governance. Now, what's now happened is, now given that the social architecture of the labourhood has all but disappeared, the move now is to build new practices of direct democracy through the forms of dispersed sociality that have emerged in and against the deregulated city. So we start talking about communities of lifestyle and leisure, as well as livelihood, virtual communities of interest and affiliation, as well as face-to-face and place-to-place. Community becomes redefined as a pop-up moral economy centred on the gift, celebrating the symbolic value of the relationship between people in the act of exchange. It's a figure of transience, not stability, liminality, not cohesion, a site of bonding, but not bondage. Unless I thought, well, I had an afterthought about that. If you remember the gay SM community, bondage is bonding. So, but you know, that's a kind of somewhat exceptional rule. But in other words, community, this notion of community, left notion of communitarianism, sees order emerging through variety, not being imposed on variety. Community as commons. Well, it's good news in one way, because that's kind of sponsored a kind of explosion of varieties of activisms. I mean, you just think about kind of environmental politics. You have guerrilla gardeners. Actually, I've got a few pictures here. Well, you've got the pop-up. I mean, there's an argument whether you think festivals are pop-up commons, but they are. You've got guerrilla gardeners. You've got urban explorers. You can either climb up buildings or break into underground stations, open up the city that's been hidden. You have skateboarders who are kind of reclaiming the architecture of the city. You have people mapping subterranean London. You have, obviously, the situationist sort of version of it, and so on. And this is a rather interesting example of how the gay community that's both kind of site-specific and also goes virtual. So you have a kind of map of a cruising ground in Stoke Newington and, of course, Grindr. And here's a project, a rather interesting project, mapping the urban commons in different cities in Europe. Right, I just wanted to end by showing you a very interesting project which is called Common Ground, which started in the late 80s, but did a whole series of projects in southern England in the millennium. And it was formed by a group of radical environmentalists. Well, this is rather, I think, I don't have to interpret it. I think you can see how that works. The idea of an organic community. Well, I haven't got time, so I have to. These are some of the maps. Now, what's interesting about this is they worked with, mainly in small towns and villages in southeast England. They worked with all age groups. Probably the usual suspects got involved. In other words, the people who are already involved in community organisations in those places. The whole idea was to try and grasp the historical individuality of places, but not to get trapped in the kind of localism, in a sort of a very kind of localised sort of sense of what that was about. And I think they drew on a convention of mapping that predates a lot of stuff, actually, medieval maps that used to have framings of kind of symbolic sort of images and so on. In these cases, many of these places were very concerned with the impact of globalization, the impact of new road infrastructure. Environmental issues were important for them. And in the maps they made, what they tended to do was to kind of frame out the new houses that are being built, perhaps on the edge of the village or the town. They concentrated on the older, more established kind of places and the narratives that went with them. And I think that's one of the problems with this kind of, I mean, they're very beautiful. You imagine these are just groups of ordinary folk getting together in village halls and so on, working with artists and producing a kind of composite collective statement of what their community at this particular moment in time meant for them. So this is the kind of material they produced. Now this is the most interesting map, I think, because Copthorne is very close to Heathrow. And in fact, the Copthorne Manor that has actually been turned into a hotel for the kind of globetrotters that kind of land in Heathrow, and they want to sort of stay overnight in a nice traditional English village, so they kind of stay there. And you can see they've got these very organic forms. You can just see. I mean, there's all kind of roots, R-O-O-T, not R-O-U-T-E-S, and all these very organic forms in which all the community organisations are placed. Right. Well, I'm going to have to fill it out. I think why I'm interested in mapping and the work we're doing is I think it is one way into bringing disparate groups together to consider not only what's immediately happening on their own patch, but relate that to wider issues of what's happening in the city, issues to do with changing economic structures and so forth. And I personally found, and this is an example from a rather wonderful book Rebecca Solnit and her colleagues produced, where they made an atlas of San Francisco, which precisely made those sorts of connections. I think it's that kind of approach, that kind of practice, that can help us actually move to a rather more optimistic sense of what is possible, because you actually see what you actually see, and I experienced this, is people who feel that their lives are not on the official maps, whose stories are not kind of registered or amplified, can actually not only have their own say, but connect what they're saying to what other disparate groups they wouldn't normally talk to or even think about are actually saying. And it's creating that kind of common ground that I think we need to think about, how practically we do it, what kinds of theorizations we build around that. And I think at that point, I'll have to hand over to Jeremy.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great honour, and thanks for arranging this very interesting panel, though I'm afraid you're not likely to be entertained by a huge amount of political disagreement between myself and Phil and Hilary. I thought it might be more entertaining if I pretended to be a sort of radical liberal who thinks that the liberation of the individual from the bonds of community is the greatest achievement of Western modernity.